a mysterious encounter at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It was a mildly overcast day on July 23rd of 2022 that started out with clouds in the sky. I remember that there was a mist in the air, but the type that's common here in the Great Smoky Mountains. Ultimately, the day was a standard Thursday morning, the air cool and crisp, eventually turning into a warm afternoon ahead. As with every morning, I first checked into the ranger station. I reviewed the day's assignments, scanned through the logbooks for any notes or reports from the night shift, and received updates about any specific areas of the park that needed attention. Today, I had been assigned to patrol the Cades Cove Loop. The loop is one of the most frequented spots in the park, with visitors often flocking to it for picnics, hikes, and a chance to spot some of the park's indigenous wildlife like deer and wild turkeys. Due to its popularity, it requires regular oversight to ensure that trails are clear, visitors are safe, and wildlife is undisturbed. My initial activities usually start with checking the condition of the loop's pathway. After heavy rains, there could be minor landslides or obstructions, and occasionally we'd find fallen branches or other debris blocking the route. It's also common for visitors to report lost items or wildlife sightings, so I always keep a keen eye out for anything unusual or out of place. Next, I make a pit stop at the designated picnic areas, ensuring that trash is properly disposed of and that all fire pits are extinguished. Cades Cove has several viewing points, and I typically stop by them to greet visitors, provide any information they might need, and, of course, soak in the picturesque views of the majestic Smokies. As I drove my park vehicle, I noticed a few trees that had been strangely uprooted. Near one of the upturned roots, I saw large footprints that didn't match any animal I knew of. The odd part was that there was a peculiar, overwhelming smell in the air. A blend of skunk, something musty, and an undeniable tinge of body odor. As I continued, the strange aroma intensified. Suddenly, I heard a series of whooping noises from the thickets nearby, followed by a loud yelp. Slowly approaching the source of the noise, my heart pounding loudly in my ears, I came to a small clearing. There, standing tall and overwhelming, was a creature unlike any I'd ever seen. It was massive, close to 9 feet, and its body was draped in various shades of brown fur from reddish-brown to a deep, dark hue. Its face was clear of any hair and had an unmistakable ape-like quality, crowned with a cone-shaped head. The eyes, black and bead-like, stared at me, giving me an eerie feeling of being deeply evaluated. I stood there watching, but the creature didn't seem to show any immediate aggression. It just emitted a low growl, making its large chest vibrate. The absence of a distinct neck only added to its intimidating stature. The gravity of the situation was not lost on me. Facing an unknown creature of this size in its personal habitat, I knew I had to act cautiously and with deliberation. My first instinct was to ensure my own safety without escalating the situation. Maintaining eye contact with the creature, I slowly reached for my whistle and gave a short, sharp blow. The sound could act as both a deterrent to the creature and a call for assistance to any nearby rangers or hikers who might hear it. I simultaneously reached for my radio, being careful not to make any jerky movements that could be perceived as threatening. "Base, this is Ranger Daniel at Cades Cove Loop," I whispered into the radio, trying to mask the uneasiness in my voice. "I've encountered a large, unknown creature near the west clearing. Need assistance." While waiting for a response, I began to make subtle, measured movements to place a tree between the creature and myself, providing a potential barrier should the situation escalate. I also mentally marked potential escape routes and trees I could potentially climb, always keeping the creature within my peripheral vision. The creature, in response to my whistle, tilted its head slightly, appearing more curious than threatened. It took a step toward me, and I instinctively took 2 steps back, signaling my intent not to invade its space any further. Then, the radio crackled to life. "Ranger Daniel, backup is en route. Stay calm and keep us updated." The acknowledgement was comforting, but I knew that until help arrived, it was going to be a delicate dance between the creature and me. The next few minutes felt like a surreal standoff, where both the creature and I sized each other up, each uncertain of the other's intentions. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and the distant chirping of birds seemed to fade into the background. Then, a new noise pierced the silence. It was a soft rustling from the direction of the woods opposite the clearing. Both I and the creature turned our gazes to identify the source. Emerging from the tree line, a smaller version of the creature, presumably its offspring, tentatively stepped into the clearing. It let out a quiet, curious chirp, glancing back and forth between its larger counterpart and me. The larger creature, perhaps a parent or guardian, made a series of low, whooping sounds, seemingly communicating with the smaller one. It was a touching and intimate moment, suggesting a depth of social bond and interaction. Recognizing this, I decided to retreat further, not wanting to intrude upon their reunion or provoke any protective instincts. As I stepped back, the larger creature seemed to acknowledge my gesture. With one last lingering look, it gently nudged the younger creature, and the two slowly made their way deeper into the woods, their forms disappearing into the thick foliage. When reinforcements finally arrived, the clearing was silent, the creatures gone. My colleagues and I combed the vicinity, seeking any further signs or traces of the creatures, but to no avail. It felt as if the forest had swallowed them up. We later set up a perimeter around the clearing, not to cage in or capture, but to protect and respect the space of these creatures. Going forward, I also feel it's crucial to set up some motion-activated cameras around the loop and surrounding areas. I also think that park visitors should be informed of the sighting and asked to remain cautious. But I'm not sure if that part will happen. And lastly, we should also consider reaching out to local wildlife experts and perhaps cryptozoologists to better understand what I witnessed that day. While this creature did not show any direct signs of hostility, it's always best to respect and maintain a safe distance from all wildlife, known or unknown. Safety is paramount, so please everyone, stay safe. I'm a retired park ranger at Yellowstone National Park. I retired in 2006 after 35 years of total service. 27 of those years, I was a ranger at Yellowstone. And I was a seasonal ranger for 8 years before that. I grew up in Montana, just outside of the park. My father was a ranger here, and my grandfather was a ranger at Glacier National Park. It's been in my blood since I was a child. I always knew that I wanted to be a park ranger, and there was never any doubt in my mind that Yellowstone was where I belonged. I've seen a lot of changes in the park over the years, but one thing has always stayed the same. Yellowstone is an amazing place full of natural beauty and wonder. It's truly a national treasure, and I'm proud to have been a part of its history. I've seen strange occurrences in my time as a ranger. Bears behaving oddly, elk acting strangely, even the geysers behaving erratically. But I've never seen anything like what happened in the summer of 2001. It was a hot day in July, and the park was full of visitors. I was doing my usual rounds, making sure everyone was staying safe and on the trails. I was near Swan Lake, which is a few miles south of Mammoth Hot Springs. The north side of the lake in the flats is where you can see a lot of real-life wilderness play out, like a grizzly bear hunting for newborn elk. I've seen my share of wildlife around the lake, but that day, I saw something that still gives me nightmares. This was the third day I was patrolling this area, and I had yet to see anything out of the ordinary. That is until I headed south towards Indian Creek campgrounds on Bighorn Pass Trail. Bighorn Pass Trail is a strenuous hike with an incline that seems to never end. It's about a 3-hour hike from Swan Lake to the top of the pass. The trail stretches over 19 miles through a lot of open meadows and crosses the Gallatin Range. We tell visitors that there is no off-trail travel from May to November because of grizzly bears. It was about 2 in the afternoon when I started to get a weird feeling, like I was being watched. But there was nobody around for miles. The only sound was the crunching of my boots on the trail. I had hiked this trail dozens of times, and I knew every turn and every hill. But for some reason, I felt like I was lost. I stopped and looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No strange sounds, no strange smells, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to radio in to the park headquarters and let them know my location, just in case something happened. 700 Charlie, this is Ranger Marshall. I'm on Bighorn Pass Trail near Indian Creek campgrounds. Do you copy? There was no answer. I tried again. 700 Charlie, this is Ranger Marshall. I'm on Bighorn Pass Trail near Indian Creek campgrounds. Do you copy? Again, there was no answer. 700 Charlie is the Chief Ranger's office. It was odd that I didn't receive a response. I started to feel a sense of dread wash over me. I knew that something wasn't right. I decided to turn around and head back towards my vehicle. It was about this time that I started feeling a sense of panic. I've never had a panic attack before this, so I didn't really know what it was like, but I was sweating a lot and I could feel my heart in my throat as I was walking quickly back towards my vehicle. It was then where I noticed this awful smell, like something had died. I didn't notice this on the way there. I thought to myself, how in the hell didn't I smell this on the way here? Then I heard the response from the ranger's office. 700 Charlie copy, we have your location. Is everything all right? I responded with, I'm not feeling well, and I'm heading back to my vehicle. I think I'm having a panic attack. Something isn't right. Do you need us to send another ranger to your location? They answered. I said, no, I'm almost to my vehicle. I'll see you in 20 minutes. It was after I responded that I felt like I was in a dream. I was panicked. It smelled awful, and the forest around the trail felt surreal, like all wildlife was gone. I stopped to look around, and the trees just looked different. My boots felt different. I kind of felt like I was outside of my body watching me look around. It's really hard to explain. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards ahead on the trail. It just came out from behind the trees. This area is known for grizzlies, but this wasn't a grizzly. It stood about as tall as one, but it wasn't as wide. I've seen my fair share of grizzlies in my 35 years of being a ranger, and I tell you, this was not a bear. It was still daylight, but I was in a heavily wooded area on the trail. The visibility was good, but it was shaded from the canopy of trees. I was already feeling panicked, and they say that when you have a panic attack, the fight or flight response kicks in. Well, I froze. I literally couldn't move. I couldn't even grab my radio in that moment. This massive creature walked out onto the trail, so now I could see it in full view, full visibility. It was a gigantic, dog-like creature, like something out of a movie. It was standing on its hind legs, but not like a dog or a wolf would. It was standing like it was supposed to be standing that way, like it was designed to be upright. It was covered in fur, but its coat wasn't full or thick all over. It was spotted and mangy like a sick dog or something. I couldn't make out what color it was, but it was dark brown or black. It was too hard to tell with the shade from the trees. It had these yellow eyes, kind of like cat eyes, where they are staring straight into your soul. That was the most terrifying aspect of this creature. It had a snout too, but not something I've ever seen before. It was slowly moving across the trail while its eyes never left me. I was frozen. I didn't want to move. I couldn't move. It was all I could do to keep standing while this creature was staring at me. The entire encounter happened for a minute, but it felt like an eternity. I glanced down at my radio to grab it, and when I looked back up, I heard it run off into the woods. I've seen deer run through the woods at amazing speeds, but this was something else. I saw it disappear into the woods at a faster rate than I've seen any deer traverse the forest. I just encountered an alpha predator, and I was still standing there on the trail. I grabbed my water and took a drink. I could feel the cold water go down my throat. I started walking back towards my vehicle, trying to process what just happened. Was this just in my head because I was having an anxiety attack? Can anxiety attacks make you hallucinate? All of these crazy thoughts were going through my head as I was walking back on the trail. I finally got to my vehicle and sat in the driver's seat. I sat there for a few minutes, just trying to calm down and think rationally about what just happened. I decided to drive back to the ranger station and tell them what happened. Maybe they can help me make sense of this. When I got there, I told them everything. They looked at me with this look of disbelief, but I could also see the wheels turning in their heads, like they were trying to decide if they should believe me or not. The thing is, I know what I saw. It was real. It wasn't an animal that I've ever seen before, and it wasn't something from my imagination. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what I saw, but I know that it was real. It was some type of werewolf. 2 years later, in 2003, another ranger by the name of Josh Bates had a similar encounter with what he described as a werewolf. He was out on patrol in the same general area when he heard something off in the distance. He couldn't tell what it was, but he knew it wasn't an animal that he was familiar with. His encounter was real similar to mine. Josh and I were friends before, but after we both experienced what we saw, we got even closer and have remained really good friends to this day. Our families get together at least once a month, and that story comes up quite a bit. I had told my wife at the time, and I don't know what she believed, but after hearing Josh state the same thing, she's a believer. It's not something we joke around about because if you have ever experienced something like this, well, it's life-changing. I was way more cautious when out on patrol after that happened. We tell everyone to stay on the trails during certain times of the year on Bighorn Pass Trail, but then again, this happened on the trail. We can't exactly put a sign up or anything, and visitors would think we are crazy if we did. It's just one of those things that some rangers have experienced, and we know that there are unknown creatures roaming Yellowstone. I loved my time as a park ranger, and I love Yellowstone. If you haven't been, you need to go sometime in your life, but be careful out there. I'm not one of those crazy people you read about that claims there are aliens living among us, or that their neighbor is really a Martian in disguise. I'm an educated person with my Master of Science in mathematics, but once I've seen something with my own eyes, there's no way someone's going to convince me I imagined it, and that's what our government is trying to do. I'm planning to tell everyone what I saw until they're forced to admit their cover-up. I live in Prescott Valley, Arizona. It's a pretty decent part of the country without all that glitter and splash you see in the city. This was a Sunday afternoon, and I was driving along Iron Springs Road, a section out by the Granite Mountain Wilderness area. It's a good drive to clear your head. You can see for miles, and sometimes you can spot pronghorn herds in the distance. I was heading back home, so it was later in the day, probably around 5:30 when I saw it. There was a flash in the sky up ahead like an explosion, and I could see something falling down fast. My first thought was, it was a small plane that had run into trouble. I checked my phone first to call 911, but I had no signal. I drive a Pathfinder SUV, so I had no worries about going off-road, and I figured somebody might need help fast. I tried to pinpoint the place where I had seen it go down and got ready for a bumpy ride. In about 5 minutes, I came upon the scene of the accident. I couldn't drive all the way up since the wreckage was up on top of a rocky knoll, but I hopped out of my truck and jogged up there. I couldn't believe my eyes when I cleared the last boulder. There was some kind of weird, small craft laying on the ground in front of me. It was all angular and pointy and made of some sort of shimmery, silver-green material. I can't tell you what shape it originally had because the thing was broken in half, all twisted up and smoking. I was just fixated on the weird metal, or whatever it was, trying to figure out what the heck I was seeing. So I'm standing there, about 15 feet away from the thing, when something moves. A creature, notice I don't say person, came out from where it must have been standing behind the wreckage. It was small, probably no bigger than 5 feet tall, but it still scared me speechless. It wasn't human. It looked like the iconic alien pictures you see. Thin body, skinny arms and legs, big oval-shaped head, big black bug eyes. It focused on me, and I was terrified, even though I got the feeling it was injured. There were no cuts or anything on it that I could see. No green blood oozing or anything like that. It was just this feeling I had. I can't explain it, like I knew it was hurt and I knew it was sad. It made me think that another one of its kind didn't survive the crash. All at once, I kind of knew these things. No explanation as to how or why. I was too freaked out to even care if it needed help. I just wanted to be away from there as fast as I could. But then something strange happened. It was just fixing me with this look, and suddenly I was stepping toward it, not away. It was like my feet had a mind of their own. I'm ashamed to say, I remember hearing myself whimpering like a dog. I was so scared and so powerless. It was the most frightening thing I'd ever experienced. I felt like it was somehow dragging me forward, but then all of a sudden, I heard this noise, and the dragging forward feeling stopped all at once. I still couldn't move, but at least I wasn't being forced to come closer. It was a loud ringing sound, like the sound waves after you hit a thin piece of metal, but way louder, and the air seemed to be pressing in on my head. It seriously felt like that, like I was getting squished on all sides by the air itself. A bright light came shooting in from the east. I know that because the sun was setting behind me in the west. The light was a bluish color and it was really bright. And then suddenly this thing appeared overhead. A ship, I guess. I mean, it was bigger than a house and I couldn't see the whole thing. It appeared all at once. Boom. Suddenly just there, looming over us. I hunched down, covering my head when a beam shot out of the bottom, shining on the wreckage. I heard this terrible, loud, screeching noise. All at once, I realized I could move, and I ran like hell, feeling like something terrible was coming. I booked it, stumbling over rocks and praying I didn't fall. I just had this awful feeling of foreboding. I knew I had to get away. I got to my truck and hopped in and took off. I was too scared to do anything but just drive for a minute or two, and when I finally risked a look in the rearview mirror, I could still see that beam of light as bright as a lightning bolt. I drove straight to the Prescott Police Department, which was about 25 minutes away. Within 5 minutes, I was regretting my decision. They didn't take me seriously, asked if I'd been drinking, acted like the whole thing was a joke. After a few minutes of feeling foolish, I went home and looked up UFOs on the web and found out there's a national UFO reporting center. They have a 24-hour hotline too, and so I called and talked to a real person, and they gave me a reference number. At the time, they seemed to take me very seriously, but I waited a week and still hadn't heard anything, so I called back. After having my call rerouted 3 times, I finally talked to an official. He told me an agent investigated and found evidence of a small meteorite crash in the area, off Iron Springs Road. He then went on to try and tell me I'd not seen anything more than a dust cloud kicked up by the impact. Oh yeah, a dust cloud looks like an alien being. I'm no fool. Obviously, they went out and collected the ship's debris, and they're keeping the info from the public. I just wish I had pictures. Anyway, I know what I saw, and I encourage everyone to spread my story. Let's not let the facts get buried. While I have never gone out looking for the supernatural, I do enjoy exploring the kinds of places where you would expect to run into things that go bump in the night. I enjoy hiking around swamps, exploring abandoned houses, and I've even done a ghost hunt or 2. I never saw anything out of the ordinary while doing any of these activities. So I assumed that all the stories I've heard about strange creatures weren't real. But then on a bright sunny day while at work, I had my assumptions smacked upside down. I'm a plumber by trade, so I'm used to seeing disgusting things inside pipes, but I am not used to coming face to face with monsters from my nightmares in there. About 2 months ago, I was called into a job where the client had nasty smells seeping up from their drains and strange howling noises coming from inside their walls. I figured it was some sort of blockage that was vibrating the pipes. I was wrong. My first move in these types of jobs is to snake the drain. If you're not someone who knows anything about plumbing, a drain snake is just a coiled up cable that you shove down the pipes to physically break up the blockage. The cable is a flexible metal wire, so it can move but be tough. If you have enough experience, you can tell a lot from a drain snake. I can tell how wide the pipes are and when it turns based on how much contact the snake is making as it bounces from side to side every time. So in this case, I was cranking the wheel that controls its descent and was expecting to feel some resistance when I hit the clogged spot, but it never happened. Eventually, I felt the tip of the snake enter an open chamber. It was no longer hitting the walls of the pipe, so I knew I was in the large main sewer line under the house that led to the public lines in the street. There was clearly no blockage. Now this was odd, but not the end of the world. I started to wind the snake back up, but it suddenly snagged on something. I tried to maneuver it around to get it free, but it wouldn't budge. Then it was suddenly ripped out of my hands like it was a fishing pole, and a monster fish got my line. The crank on the end of the snake was too big to get pulled into the drain, so it rattled around the sink while whatever was down there was ripping the cable around. Eventually it came to a stop, and I tentatively and slowly coiled the snake back up. The homeowner had come into the kitchen at this point because he heard the commotion. I told him what just happened, and we both stood there dumbfounded as I pulled the tip of the snake out of the drain to reveal that the cable was frayed like it was gnawed on by something with a tremendous bite force. The homeowner looked at me and said, "What does that mean?" I said, "First time I've ever seen that happen." He asked me what we should do next, but I didn't answer right away. I was both confused and concerned by what had just happened. He asked me again, and I snapped out of it. I then told him about our video drain inspection service. We have a special cable with a camera at the end that we run down the main sewer line of a house when we suspect there is a crack in the pipes or tree roots pushing into them. It's basically a colonoscopy for your house, and it ain't cheap. He was getting suspicious of me now. I could tell he thought I did something funny with the drain snake to get him to pay for a more expensive service. However, I told him he could have the video drain inspection for free because I wanted to know what the hell was down there. So we both walked outside and grabbed the video unit. Now you might have seen at some point a white PVC pipe with a cap sticking straight up from the ground in your yard. That's the access point for your house's main sewer line. I found his and ran the video cable down into the pipe and all the way out to the main line under the street. Everything was pretty standard. The pipes didn't show any signs of cracks or blockages. I was about to give him the all clear, even though it had me even more confused, when I saw something move. The pipes are dark and the camera doesn't produce a crystal clear image, so it can be hard to make things out. But the camera was picking up something moving around in there, and it didn't have the shape like any creature I could think of. So I snapped a grainy picture on the machine before there was a massive yank on the end as the creature discovered the cable and ripped it to shreds. At this point, I told the client to call the city sewer guys to figure it out. But I will regret that decision for the rest of my life. I saw 2 weeks later that 2 city workers were found dead at the bottom of a manhole. This was in 2019. They still haven't figured out the cause of death, and the newspaper were very light on the details. I wanted to reach out to the customer and ask if anything else happened under his home, but I was too ashamed and felt guilty for sending those city workers down there, even though that is exactly what anyone else would have done. I try to tell myself that it's not my fault, that someone would have eventually had to go down there to clean the sewers, but it doesn't help. We always think of unknown creatures being hidden in the remote places of the world or being far away from humans, but what could be more remote than the sewers below us? Who's to say that some nightmare creature couldn't wander into our pipes and find itself at home? It was definitely larger than I would have expected, and it even seemed to morph in size based on which part of the pipe it was in. I watched it for a while, trying to decipher what it was, but I couldn't for the life of me figure it out. From 2010 through 2015, I was living out of a van. I would travel all over the country, staying in Walmart parking lots, my friends' driveways, campsites, and oftentimes just down some path into the woods that was wide enough to fit my vehicle. I have countless wild adventure stories from that 5-year period, but I'll share with you the one that really left a mark, both physically and mentally. For the last few years of my adventures, I had stuck to the east coast of the United States, slowly making my way north to New Hampshire and Maine in the warmer months, and then heading slowly south as the winter approached to avoid the blistering cold of the northern states of the eastern U.S. I had made friends and contacts from Florida to Maine and would stop for a week or two at certain locations to work, make some travel money, and visit with people I knew along the way. In 2014, while heading north, I had decided to pass through New Jersey. That year, I met and made friends while camping with some New Jersey people known as Pineys. They call themselves that because they live in a little-known but fairly vast forest in the southern half of the state known as the Pine Barrens. These good folks took an instant liking to me and had spent almost a week living at my campsite with me at one point. They worked as roofers during the day. They were super friendly, fiercely loyal, and hardworking, and we got to know each other pretty well. So in 2015, as I was headed south for Central Florida, I made sure to swing by New Jersey again to hang out with them and make a little cash roofing with them. We spent 6 12-hour days roofing together and camped out in my van at my friend's small blueberry farm in the Pine Barrens. On the 7th day, I decided that after hearing endless tales about the wonders of the Pine Barrens that I needed to explore those woods of southern New Jersey for a bit before heading south for the winter. I went online and found a campsite that allowed for vehicle camping, which was perfectly situated on the Mullica River. The area had miles and miles of hiking trails. I kept a rather expensive folding mountain bike in my van and was always looking for a chance to take it out and explore. Due to the very flat land of the area, the Pine Barrens was the perfect place for that. I set up camp and was thrilled on the first night to be able to have a huge fire and enjoy the cool night air while losing myself in the dance of the flickering flames. I spent the next few days mountain biking around the wilderness, fishing the river right behind my campsite and howling back and forth with the local coyotes at night. On the 4th night, things began to get weird. The coyotes that had kept me company each prior night were nowhere to be found, and I kept hearing a loud whistling every so often in the woods around my campsite, just like a human whistle, but louder. Around midnight, I could hear somebody slowly circling me as I sat at my fire. It sounded too calculated and purposeful to be an animal. It actually sounded like a human on 2 feet, trying to be quiet as they moved through the dead and dry leaves just out of sight of the firelight. I started throwing my larger logs of firewood at them while threatening them to get away. After whoever it was walked off into the woods, I started feeling uneasy, and so I grabbed my gun out of the van and kept it in my jacket pocket. When most people think of New Jersey, they think of a densely populated cityscape or Jersey Shore beaches. But make no mistake, southern New Jersey can be as remote as parts of West Virginia. At that point, I decided that it would be best to keep my gun on me for the rest of my time out there just to be safe. The next day, I spent exploring the area on foot. I hiked for miles and came across what looked like a primitive campsite. It had 2 small shelters made from branches and twisted saplings, all weaved together. Inside one of the shelters was a few items of old torn clothing, an old non-functioning boombox, and a few faded chrome pieces of a car. The shelters were in no way weatherproof, as there was no way to keep the rain out of them, so I was very confused as to why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to build them. Both shelters had a thick bed of pine needles in them, and they smelled like skunk mixed with a barnyard. On the edge of the campsite, on all sides, were trees of all sizes that had either been pushed down or fallen over with roots sticking out of the sandy soil. That afternoon, after a long day of exploration, I made my way back to my van, had a big meal, and went to sit on a bed of perfect moss along the edge of the river to watch the sunset. The sun was about to dip down behind the trees, and I was sitting there with my headphones on listening to music while waiting for the evening to slowly creep in. I was feeling so alive. Just then, that same skunky barnyard stench filled the air and overwhelmed me. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. Right as I began to pivot to my right to look behind me, I felt my head and body snap to my left, and what felt like a massive electric shock pass through me. I was awakened by the pain of a series of sharp tree branches scratching across the left side of my face. As I opened my eyes, I saw the ground beneath me moving, and my chin was bouncing hard off of something that was covered with coarse hair. At the same time, the world around me moved in a blurry confusion. The pain in my head was almost unbearable, and I fought to stay awake. These first few seconds were very confusing to me. I opened my eyes again and struggled to look around. But when my vision began to come into focus, I saw what looked like 2 huge, hairy legs below me, moving in stride. Then suddenly I felt another, almost unbearable pain as my ankles were compressed together. As my mind cleared, I realized that a creature was carrying me over its shoulder and moving quickly through the woods. I immediately thought, am I being kidnapped by a Bigfoot? But I couldn't rationalize that at all. I was in a state of shock. I was also in pain from my head to my feet, but a huge surge of fear and adrenaline hit me, and all of a sudden I was wide awake. I was too afraid to start kicking and screaming, so I went into a mental panic as I searched for an option in my throbbing head. I rolled onto my right side and finally got a good look at what had been carrying me. It was indeed a Bigfoot. There was no doubt at what I was looking at. The Bigfoot was large and sported a full body covering of matted black hair. It was covered in leaves, pine needles, and what looked like dreadlocks. He was stumbling around trying to pull me along, and I just started beating on him and kicking with all my might. The Bigfoot turned its face to look directly at mine, like it was sending me a message. It had a mixture of pain and pure rage on his face. This kicked up my fear level to where I thought I would die from fright. But then I remembered my gun and was able to get a hand on it and pull it out. I pointed that thing right at its face. But obviously, the creature knew damn well what a gun was, and it instantly turned away, dropped me, and started to run. I could hear it crashing through the brush and the trees like a freight train as it ran off into the distance. I stayed there on my side for a moment, still pointing the gun and shaking violently. After a few seconds of total shock, I came to my senses and said out loud to myself, "What if it comes back?" I was instantly overwhelmed with panic, jumped to my feet, and sprinted as fast as I could in the opposite direction that the monster had gone. I ran for only a few hundred yards before I began to recognize where I was. It would seem that the Bigfoot had only gone a short distance with me. I was able to get to my campsite quickly and started frantically throwing everything haphazardly into my van. I was sure that this thing was going to come back for revenge at any moment. I jumped into the driver's seat, then I fired up the engine, stomped on the gas, and ripped the hell out of there. After a few miles of driving at high speed down dirt roads, I finally came out to the pavement, and only then did my fear finally begin to subside. At that same time that my heart started to slow a little bit, the pain in my head and face spiked to a horrible level. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror and realized how bloody and jacked up my face was, so I headed for the nearest hospital. When I got to the emergency room, I had not even considered what I was going to tell them had happened to me. I looked like I was hit by a bus and felt like it too. I decided to tell them that I was attacked by someone in the woods while camping. This was a bad idea as they had a police officer there within a few minutes to take a report. He could tell I was not telling the truth and told me stop holding out on him. I told him I was attacked from behind and never saw who did it. He didn't believe me, but I stuck to my story and he eventually left. Turns out I had suffered a bad concussion, a broken orbital socket, a laceration below my eyebrow requiring multiple stitches, as well as a torn eardrum in my right ear. Next day, my face swelled up so badly that my right eye was swollen shut, and my jaw hurt so badly that I couldn't chew for about a week. The whole right side of my face was one giant purple bruise. I think that the Bigfoot had smacked me hard upside the right side of my head, but I can't be sure. Needless to say, I never went camping in the Pine Barrens after that. I called my friends from the area and told them what had happened to me, and they confirmed that every so often, someone will encounter a Bigfoot-like creature in the woods around where they live. I lost my love of living in a van after the attack. I was too terrified to sleep in secluded areas or anywhere that had any kind of wooded area nearby. This severely reduced my options and made the van life too costly and difficult. I'm also not yet able to enjoy being in the woods, even if it's just a simple walk down a path with my dog. Every little noise, even just the rustle of leaves by a chipmunk, sends adrenaline surging through my veins. The lessons I learned were this: Always be armed and never do anything outside with headphones on. You never know what might be creeping up behind you. I came across your channel while doing some paranormal research on things that have happened to me recently. It is both terrifying and comforting to know that a lot of other people in the world have had similar occurrences to mine. After binging your channel to find cases like my own, I figured it's only fair that I contribute to the channel and share what happened to me. Maybe this will help someone else make sense of their own paranormal occurrence. I'm a general contractor. I started in construction after high school and worked my way up over the years. I'm no master at anything in particular, but I can build just about anything after years of working on different jobs. I started up my own company 7 years ago. Every contractor has a few weird stories. Any job that involves working with the public, especially in their homes, is bound to expose you to strange situations, but few contractors have stories bordering on the paranormal. Lucky me. It started out normal. I was hired to install a new septic tank for a young couple who just bought their first home. This was before housing prices skyrocketed, but they were still very budget conscious. The place was an old, turn-of-the-century farmhouse that was in bad shape. They bought the old house thinking they could use the money that they saved to fix it up. I've seen this happen a lot with younger people. Trendy social media videos and HGTV make people think that they can buy a fixer-upper and make it their own. They quickly realize that it takes more than good intentions to do major renovations. It pissed me off at first. I felt insulted that so many kids thought my job was so easy that they could do it without training. But then I realized how much money I was making when they found out they bit off more than they could chew. So I made my peace with it. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Creepy old farmhouse equals standard ghost encounter. But I never actually stepped foot inside the house. I was digging in the backyard to install the septic tank when I made an unfortunate discovery. Bones, and a lot of them. 9 times out of 10 when you dig up a bone, it belongs to an animal. But if I'm ever in doubt, I call the police and report it immediately. It is illegal to continue to dig at a site that may have human remains, and I don't make it a habit of risking my contractor license. The cops came. The forensic team confirmed the bones were human, and a special crime scene excavation team dug out the rest of the bones without disturbing their placement. Over 24 skeletons were arranged in 2 circles, one inside the other, surrounding a large elk skull in the center. The forensic team said the bones were a few hundred years old, at least early colonial times, but probably even earlier. It was clear that the burial site was not normal based on the arrangement of the bodies, and there were clear scrape marks on most of the neck bones. The forensic team said it indicated the victims had their throats slit. The whole site looked like some kind of sacrificial ritual. It did sort of bother me a bit, thinking about what had happened there. History is fascinating, but I was more concerned with them finishing up the excavation so I could get back to work on the septic tank and get paid. But that night, something strange happened. I knew it was a dream instantly, which is strange, because I've never had that happen before. I was in my own room, but there was no ceiling. I saw stars above me, but they were strange colors and moving around erratically. Then, an antlered figure appeared in the room and circled around me. He or it had markings all over his body. I don't know if they were tattoos or paint, but they twisted up and around his body in deliberate patterns. He wasn't showing any signs of aggression, but his presence was menacing. He just kept circling me. His face was stern but confused. Then, in the blink of an eye, he shoved me hard in the chest and knocked me back into bed. I woke up with a pain in my chest. I shrugged off the nightmare, but I had a red mark in the shape of a hand on my chest. That was a lot harder to shrug off. The entire time I drove to the work site, I had a feeling of uneasiness. When I got there, the owner came out to see me, and there was a moving truck in the driveway. He was clearly upset about something, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. He said he didn't want to dig the septic tank anymore and that he was planning on selling the place anyway. I asked him why he didn't call me. He just shook his head and said he was sorry and that he completely forgot about the septic tank. He looked really shaken up. I asked him if he had a nightmare. His eyes went wide, but he tried to play it off. We stood there for a minute in silence. I could tell he wanted to say something but couldn't. I would have left it at that, but I noticed a bruise around his arm, like someone had grabbed him roughly. He noticed me staring at his arm. "Did you see him?" he asked me. "Yeah," I responded. I unbuttoned my shirt enough to show him the handprint on my chest. He looked astonished and then oddly relieved. We didn't say anything else after that. He just nodded to me and I left. Part of me wanted to ask for details to compare his dream to mine, but I thought it best to let sleeping dogs lie. It might be a little anticlimactic, but the kid clearly didn't want to talk about it. Animals don't have graveyards. They just don't. Mother Nature didn't program her little woodland creatures with sentimentality. Out in the wild, bones lay where the bodies dropped. They pile where the prey was dragged and discarded. They sink into the mud and water, polished by the wind and sun. Out in the woods, you come upon all sorts of white and yellow bones from both the old and newly deceased. You can't help it. On particularly gruesome days, parts of the animal are still attached. Pretty morbid, huh? I don't mean to sound that way. I don't relish nature's darker side. But when you have a job like mine, a national park ranger, you automatically see a lot. I've just become desensitized. When you've seen what I've seen, a few bones no longer turn your stomach. Besides, what I've seen is exactly the reason I'm telling this story. You should know up front that it changed me. It emptied me, somehow, of that sentimentality mankind was blessed with. It made my life grim. Like I said, I worked in the woods. I don't want to get anybody in trouble, so we'll leave it at that. Just know everything I did back then, I did by the book. This isn't the mournful memoir of some poacher who saw the light. Part of me wishes that was the case. I'd prefer to have seen anything except for what I did. I was cleaning up an abandoned campsite. A few college kids had sprung a tent in the middle of the woods and left behind an ecosystem of beer bottles and junk food wrappers. They were getting a ticket. We had their license plate on camera, but someone still had to clean up the mess. I was that unlucky someone. I was midway through the last trash bag when I heard a snapping sound outside the perimeter of the camp. It didn't sound like a tree branch. After the rain we had, any plant life would have sounded a lot more wet. I assumed the worst. I figured the kids' poor campsite management had lured a bear to the area. Although I couldn't see anything, I did need to confirm whether or not the campsite would be safe for the next group of visitors. The sound came from the south. There was a creek waiting for me in that direction. I found a disturbed patch of leaves and a few obscure prints in the mud. I followed them. I shouldn't have. The creek led to a small incline. There was a river further up. To the side of that incline, however, was the mouth of a shallow cave. I had checked it out before. It wasn't anything remarkable. It was barely deep enough to shelter somebody from the rain. Tourists occasionally used it to pose for photographs. In the right lighting, it could look a little creepy. That day, I saw the cave at its worst. I saw it when something was lurking inside. I yelled at it. That was stupid of me, but I thought it was a person. I thought it was one of those college kids, maybe come back to collect something they'd left behind. There were personal belongings all over the camp. I realized that I wasn't looking at a human being. At the same time, I realized that the kids might have left the campsite in a hurry for reasons other than neglect. They might have seen something too, something that demanded they get out of there. When the thing turned toward me, it was still chewing. There were pearly white twigs bulged out from between its lips, animal bones. The creature itself was astoundingly man-like. 2 arms, 2 legs with a long neck and a wide mouth, 2 black eyes the size of nickels spaced somewhat too far apart. It blinked at me, 1 eye at a time. It blinked at me and chewed, completely indifferent to my presence. I don't think I blinked back. It was skinny and naked, like a skeleton wrapped in tanned leather. Wiry, lonesome hairs jutted out around its neck and shoulders. I thought we'd watch each other forever, considering how long it stared. Then it swallowed. It raked its long fingernails across the bed of the cave. I saw a few more thin bones skid across the stone. The creature looked at its empty hand and then back to me. It must have been expecting a handful. It looked disappointed. Then it looked hungry. I realized that moment what the creature was thinking. It was thinking about all the bones tucked away inside my body. It would only have to drag those claws through a few inches of futile skin and meat. I turned and ran back up the creek. Its feet splashed loudly in the water behind me. For every deep breath that I took, I heard it shrieking in unison. It didn't make normal sounds, not for a man or for an animal. Then it screamed something unearthly and ear-splitting. I don't know if I was intentionally headed back to the campsite or back toward my car or what. I think I was just running. I know when the deconstructed tents came into view, I had an opportunity. I dove for one of the tent posts. The thin metal tube wouldn't amount for much, but it would at least give me an instrument to lash the beast that was trying to pursue me. I grabbed it, turned on my heel, swung, and saw that there was nothing there. I didn't realize that the creature had stopped chasing me. I didn't realize that at some point, the monster's screaming had been replaced by my own. I stood there a while, wondering if the footsteps in the water that I had heard chasing me were really just mine. And then I retired. I had to. I couldn't go back into the woods, any woods, without remembering that day. The wrong shadow on the wrong day would remind me of that thing's face, of the crunching bones and long claws. That's my story, beginning to end. I wish there was more. I wish I had a name for the bone eater or someone to corroborate my story. I don't, so I'm asking anyone who will listen, have you ever seen anything like that? Humans are the lucky ones, I guess. It's not like me to get creeped out when I'm out in the woods. I mean, I've spent countless hours exploring the outdoors. And I'm not just talking about regular camping where you park your car nearby. I'm talking about backpacking, where I hike 10 miles or more into remote areas. I also have no worries about going on these adventures alone. I mean, I'm sure it's partly because I'm a tall, hefty person, but I think it's mostly because I've acquired a second sense about how the woods normally feel. I mean, I've certainly come across quite a few strange and unusual people during my time outdoors. Some of them have been quite entertaining, and some have been a bit unsettling. But sometimes you kind of want to experience something out of the ordinary. So the time I'm talking about, me and a couple of my friends made a plan to go backpacking in this wild area in Northern California. I only knew about this remote spot because my dad had a friend who used to do logging work around there several years back. He was one of those no-nonsense tough guys. Back then, they were working deep in the woods with some huge bulldozers and other heavy machinery. This guy wasn't prone to joking around or making stuff up. This was Colorado, and he was a tough Colorado man. Old style. The kind whose family had been there well over a century. I'm just mentioning that because he used to talk about something weird that went down in that area. The crew had been feeling uneasy for a few days, and then they started hearing strange sounds and knocking coming from the forest that they couldn't explain. Then, one morning when they arrived at their equipment, they discovered that someone had smashed a bunch of their big drums filled with diesel fuel. Those drums weighed over 400 pounds. It would have to be some incredible force to do something like that. And the weirdest thing was, they were called off the job after that and told it was temporarily suspended. But then they never got called back. So the whole thing felt super weird. And my dad's friend mentioned the word Bigfoot a few times, which wasn't like him at all. Anyway, we specifically chose that area because we wanted to potentially experience seeing something mysterious. Two of us were open-minded and curious about the idea of Bigfoot, but our third friend didn't believe in it at all. I had my Jack Russell Terrier with me too. The trip was meant to last for about 4 days and 3 nights. On the first night, we reached our campsite in the river valley. The scenery was breathtaking. The sides of the valley were steep and rough, but there was a crystal clear stream running through the middle that was beautiful. But all of us felt unsettled right away, even during the daytime. It was like a feeling of discomfort that we couldn't shake off. Throughout the entire day, We hadn't come across or heard anyone else, but all three of us kept pausing and gazing into the trees and mountains, like our instincts were searching for something without us even realizing it. Later in the afternoon, we built a fire and just sat around talking and drinking beer. It was during this time that my friend, who was the skeptic, brought up the fact that we hadn't come across any wildlife in the area. My other friend and I realized that he was right and that we hadn't spotted a single animal since we arrived at our campsite. What made it even stranger was the absence of birds. Normally, we would hear them chirping or see them flying around, but not this time. It was right about that point when my dog started freaking out. First, he started growling, which was totally out of character for him. And then he started yapping his head off and his body got completely tense. He was staring upriver and then he just took off. I ran after him yelling at the top of my lungs, but nothing was going to stop him. He kept running for like 15 minutes and then he veered off and suddenly stopped at this chain link fence. That took me completely by surprise. Of all the things I was expecting to see, a fence was not it, and the most foul stench you ever smelled just filled the air. My dog wouldn't stop barking, but I was finally able to grab him and I just clamped his jaws together so I could listen. It was approaching sunset by then, so it was getting really shadowy. I was staring through this fence and I swore I could see some kind of light through the trees, like a light bulb kind of light on a building. But there was no way in heck there should be a building out there. But then I started hearing the most God-forsaken howling sounds coming from that direction, and every hair on my body stood up. It almost sounded like something was being tortured. I looked for any kind of signage on the fence, but there was nothing. The darker it got, the more I was convinced there was a building back there with just a couple light bulbs on it. I just turned and ran then. I had to get back before it got darker. I had gotten the worst feeling that something bad was going on there. I'm pretty sure I wasn't making much sense to my friends, but I told them we needed to get out of there, and they listened to me. We packed up as best we could and just left. I contacted the authorities and tried to explain what I saw. They said they'd get back to me, but when they did, they just said there was nothing but wilderness in that area. But I'm telling you, something is going on there. I don't know if something is being experimented on or tortured or what, but something is going on there. I'm trying to work up the courage to get back there and take some photos and videos. When my dog ran off like that, I didn't even have my phone on me. Something's definitely not right. I've been a park ranger at Redwood National and State Parks in California for over 15 years now. Growing up, I always felt a deep connection to nature. I suppose it was only natural that I'd make a career out of it. After college, I decided to go through the rigorous training to become a park ranger. I wanted to protect the land that had given me so much, and I wanted to share its wonders with others. My colleagues often joked about my sixth sense for the forest. Maybe it was because I spent so much time out there, but I often knew when something was amiss. A change in the weather, an unusual animal behavior, or even a misplaced rock. I seemed to notice it all. They'd laugh, but I took pride in that connection. Over the years, I've seen my fair share of injured animals, lost hikers, and minor mishaps, but nothing ever shook me to the core like the encounter I'm about to tell you about. It was a reminder that no matter how familiar you become with a place, there's always something unknown lurking just out of sight. It was a clear but slightly chilly night. The moon was out, and there was a gentle breeze that rustled the towering redwoods. I had just started my nightly patrol, working the late shift like I often do. Everything was calm, and I planned to follow my usual route through the Tall Trees Grove Trail. It's typically quiet at night, with only the sound of the forest and maybe a distant owl calling. I had my flashlight and my radio to keep me company. As I got deeper into the forest that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It's not like I hadn't walked this path 100 times before, but something in the air was different. I thought I heard a faint rustling in the distance, and the wind carried a smell I just couldn't place. It wasn't a normal forest smell, it was something more ominous. As I continued down the path, that terrible smell became more pronounced, almost like rotting meat. It was a stench that filled the air, something between death and decay, the kind of smell that sticks in your nostrils and turns your stomach. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a dead animal somewhere off the trail, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. The night was unusually still, and that's when I heard it. A cracking noise behind me, like branches breaking underfoot, followed by a strange whistling sound that seemed to echo through the trees. I turned, my heart pounding, and shone my flashlight into the darkness. That's when I saw it. The creature was standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight, hidden in the shadows, but definitely there. Its antlers were twisted and gnarled, protruding from what looked like a deer's skull, but there was something terribly wrong about it. The face was more like a human skull with 2 hollow holes where the eyes should have been, and yet glowing yellow from those depths were eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. The body was a grotesque combination of animal and something more. The legs looked like they belonged to a deer, or maybe an elk, but the skin was deteriorating off the bones, revealing a sickening skeleton beneath. Rotting flesh hung in tatters, and I could almost hear the sound of it decaying. The creature's height was alarming, easily 9 feet tall, and its presence was overwhelming. But perhaps the most terrifying thing was the sense of intelligence in those glowing eyes. It wasn't just an animal. Something about it seemed almost human. Its gaze was fixed on me, not in the way a predator looks at prey, but with an unsettling curiosity, as if it was studying me. I stood there, my body frozen in fear, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The smell of rotting flesh was now mixed with the cold, damp earth, and every instinct in me was screaming to run, but I couldn't take my eyes off the creature. It was a nightmarish vision that seemed to reach into the very core of my being, challenging everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I was frozen for what felt like an eternity, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Then the creature took a step towards me, and I snapped back to reality. I reached for my radio, all the while keeping my eyes on the creature, but it simply turned and vanished into the forest. I immediately called the sighting into headquarters, my voice shaking as I described what I had seen. I was told to return to base, and I didn't need to be told twice. I made my way back, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, but the creature was gone. After reaching base, I filled out an official report and met with my supervisor. We decided to keep the incident quiet for now, to avoid unnecessary panic, but we both knew something had to be done. I'd recommend increasing patrols in the area and perhaps bringing in some experts to investigate. It's essential to figure out what this creature is, and if it poses a threat to the park or its visitors. In the meantime, all rangers should be made aware of the sighting and take appropriate precautions. It might sound crazy, but what I saw was real, and I think it's something we need to take seriously. If nothing else, let's at least try to figure out what that horrible smell was. Maybe it's a clue to understanding what this thing is. Either way, I'll never forget those glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness of the redwoods. It's a night I'll remember for the rest of my life. It was Friday morning, June 26th of 2015. John and I had been married for a little over a year, and we were living in Akron, Ohio at the time. He told me he wanted to go on a quick weekend camping trip before we went on our big trip in Colorado later that summer, just to test everything out and see if we had all we would need. John was actually the one who always liked the idea of camping, and it sounded like a lot of fun, so I eventually came to love it too. He said his father used to take him as a kid on little trips he called bushwhacking. They would pack up whatever they needed and put it in the back of his old pickup truck and randomly head out into the forest to spend a night. I know why he loved it so much. It was because camping reminded him of his childhood. I had never met his dad, and therefore camping with John was a nice way for me to feel a part of that relationship. Anyway, I agreed that heading out for the weekend would be a good idea, so around 9 a.m. the next day we were off. We picked a destination pretty quickly, John had been to an area near Medina, not far from us, that he thought would be perfect for the weekend. The weather was supposed to be warm and sunny all week, which would make the bugs bite a little bit, but hopefully nothing too severe. When we first arrived at the campground, I was surprised at how beautiful it looked and why I had never been there before. It was a bit of a hike to get to the campsite John had picked out for us already, but he said he knew I could handle it. But to be honest, this is when my excitement started to fade away. As we were walking in, it was eerily quiet. I didn't notice it at first, but there was no wildlife around us. No birds chirping, no deer stepping out of the bushes to check us out. It didn't feel right at all. I asked John if he noticed how there wasn't anything moving around us, and he said, yeah, but maybe that was normal for this time of year. He then told me there were a lot of people in the area, and that was probably scaring everything away. That made me feel a little better, but not much. We finally arrived at our campsite around 2:30 p.m., and we immediately got to work setting it up. It was just one large tent with enough sleeping space for both of us. We had brought a lantern, some candles, food for several days, toiletries, and also, of course, our dog Oscar came along with us. We took him everywhere we went, usually because he was such a calm dog and never caused any trouble. John had also brought his axe with him just in case we needed to chop up branches for firewood or anything else. After we had everything set up, we decided to take Oscar for a little walk around the campsite. He loved to be outside sniffing and checking everything out, but after about 15 minutes of walking, he started growling and barking at some nearby trees. John told him to calm down, but he wouldn't stop. I wondered what was wrong with Oscar, and if we should be worried that he wasn't listening to John. John said not to worry because it was probably just some kind of small animal in the woods that was catching his attention. I thought that made sense, so he kept walking. After a few more minutes, Oscar started barking even worse than before, and it seemed like he was trying to lead us somewhere deeper into the forest. John told me to be sure to hold on to his leash very tightly because he didn't want him running off after whatever started scaring him. I was the first to see it. It was a dog bigger than any dog I had ever seen before. But honestly, I first thought it was a bear because of how big it actually was, but its face and snout were definitely all dog. I freaked out instantly when I saw it. I jumped backwards and screamed and started freaking out with my head still thinking that a bear was about to charge us. While doing that, I dropped Oscar's leash and he took off down another path and I took off after him. As I look back on it, it was still strangely quiet and I didn't hear John calling after me or Oscar barking in front of me. I stopped running and started trying to figure out what I should do. I decided to start heading back towards John and the creature, knowing that helping my husband was my main priority. I started retracing my steps back to where I last saw John and the creature, but then I started hearing a dog barking coming from far behind me. I got confused because the dog was too far away to be Oscar. He couldn't have gotten that far yet, but I just kept working my way back to John. A lot of questions raced through my mind, and not before long I was able to see the creature in the distance again. Had it done anything to John? Was he still there and alive? I started to panic as I got closer because I could hear it grunting and sucking in air, but I still couldn't see John. I decided to duck behind a tree to stop and get a better look without being seen, but apparently I had gotten too close and the creature must have smelled me. As soon as I stopped, it spun around and locked its eyes in my direction. Buffered by the tree, I was able to stand in place and get a good look at the thing. The creature was covered in thick, matted fur with dog-like features all over, but it was still human in shape. It stood there towering over the area on its back legs, balancing like it was nothing to stand that way. Its eyes were like laser beams, scanning the area, taking everything in and calculating. I have no idea what it was calculating, but I could tell there was some real intelligence in there. My mind was on overload and I could barely believe what I was seeing. The next thing I knew, I saw Oscar running towards me out of nowhere. He looked completely terrified and seemed hurt. He limped up to me and started whimpering like crazy. I immediately thought that maybe the creature had attacked him, and now I was worried that it had also done something to John, which made my blood run cold with fear. I knew I needed to get up to the creature and find John, so I just took off running towards, but trying to stay undercover and be as quiet as possible. It was all I knew what to do to get up there and not seem so vulnerable. Oscar followed at my heels. When we got closer to the creature, I started hearing John calling me desperately for help, and I just ran towards the sound of his voice while still staying hidden behind trees so the creature couldn't see us. Finally, we came out from behind the last tree, and there was the creature standing over John, who was down on all fours trying to get away from it. Its attention then immediately shifted onto me, but thankfully, the creature didn't seem interested in hurting John. He was just standing over him, unflinching like a prison guard. I called to John and told him to just get up and run towards us. Amazingly, the creature didn't do a thing as John scurried to his feet and ran over behind me. I got Oscar to stay close too, and we all just sort of huddled there. The creature looked us over for a moment, its mouth hanging slightly open as if it were trying to figure something out. Then, without warning, it turned around and started walking down the path away from us. We could hear it panting as it walked off, its feet thudding against the ground. Eventually, we heard it pick up speed and started bounding off into the distance until we couldn't see or hear him anymore. John was still freaking out, obviously having been traumatized by the creature attacking him and the ensuing standoff. I was trying to put my arms around him and console him, but he wasn't really responding. I was so glad that thing didn't hurt us. But why did it leave us alone? Did it just wanted to scare us or something? We were pretty confused and we didn't know what to think about its behavior, but honestly, what does it matter? The point is that we lived. We stayed quiet for a while, just sitting there, Oscar still sniffing around frantically like he needed to find the creature again, but I had a tight hold on his leash this time. Eventually, John got up, and we all started making our way back down the path towards where we left camp. And that's when I noticed creature tracks all over the place. I knew instantly they were creature tracks because they were huge and unlike any animal tracks I knew of. An almost endless number of footprints leading in circles all around the area. I don't know how one creature could have been surrounded by a ton of creature tracks, but it really got me thinking and scared. We had only seen one, but could there have been more of them that were there at the same time as us? Or were these tracks old? We had no interest in figuring out which scenario was true and just tried to pay no attention to them, but that was easier said than done. Then I noticed other things too, like creature footprints coming down from trees and creature prints leading into nearby bushes. John even started saying he saw something moving in the distance. This was when we knew we were starting to really lose it, and we pulled ourselves together and started running back to camp. It wasn't until we reached camp that we finally started to calm again. We stayed in our tent for the rest of the night. Thank God there were no further creature encounters, and we woke up at the crack of dawn and hauled ass out of there. We haven't talked about the creature since then. We try not to even think about it or talk about it, because if we do, the encounter with the creature is really triggering, and the last thing either of us ever wanted to experience. I am thankful, however, that John and I got to experience it together. That way we know how to help each other when the memories get the best of us. I hope you got something out of this story, and please always be aware that dogmen are real things that seem to be able to strike at any time. Just don't go camping alone ever again. Remember, these creatures are no joke. I knew a woman who lived most of her life alone in an off-grid cabin in western Montana. I worked for a care company. We would come to people's homes and assist them with whatever they needed. Some clients needed daily care, while others were more independent and only needed help with the shopping and cleaning around their home. Ethel was the latter client. She was in her 80s and still sane and sound enough to live at home, but she didn't like driving much anymore. I would deliver her groceries for her and take her to appointments. She had me out to clean her house once a week, but more often than not, it was already spotless. I think she just wanted the company. Ethel was a bit of an odd bird. She was a retired art teacher and spent most of her free time painting. Her walls were completely covered with her art. She was good, don't get me wrong. In fact, she was very good. However, her preferred subject matter, especially in her last few years at home, was a little odd to say the least. Most of her paintings before she went nutty were of the Montana landscape, rivers, alpine lakes, mountains, valleys of wildflowers, that type of thing. She actually made a decent amount of money selling them at local artisan fairs and flea markets for a while. But then, she started painting pictures exclusively of Bigfoot. They were good paintings too, but there isn't much of a market out there for naturalistic paintings of mythical cryptids roaming around the Montana backcountry, so she just ended up using them to decorate the walls of her cabin. As she sold more and more of her landscape pictures, the Bigfoot ones took over her home, and she became known locally as the Bigfoot Lady. I always had a good time when I visited her. She was a bit strange, I will admit, but she was kind and pleasant to be around. Many of my clients start getting a bit of dementia in their older age, and this type of thing is quite common. Sometimes when it reaches this stage, patients can get combative and difficult to interact with, but that wasn't the case with Ethel. I asked her once why she was fixated on the creature, and she said, because he lives here too. I decided not to push the subject. The following few times we talked about the creature, I just pretended I too believed it existed. Sometimes it's easier to let these people live in their delusions as long as it isn't causing harm to anyone. There was one painting in particular that caught my eye. The leaves on the trees and surrounding landscape were indicative of early autumn. The Bigfoot creature was standing tall among the trees. Its fur was two-toned. It appeared to have guard hairs like a double-coated dog or a wolf. The outside hairs were dark brown, while the shorter, seemingly undercoat hairs were white. The painting was incredibly detailed. I asked Ethel about it, about this creature's coloring, and she said that their coats changed colors with the season. They were brown during the summer and white during the winter. It helped with camouflage. She said that few people knew that about them. She said the creature known as the Yeti, or the abominable snowman. It was just a Bigfoot with its winter coat. Eventually, she had to be moved to an assisted living facility when she couldn't do as much around the house. She didn't want to leave, but I think she knew it was unrealistic for someone in her condition to be living off the grid in the wilderness. Her last 6 months in her home were strange, to say the least. She stopped painting, blaming the arthritis in her hands, but then she started creating sculptures out of natural materials. Things like tree branches, grasses, pressed flowers, pine cones. I asked her about them, and she said she didn't make them. She said Bigfoot did. She said she told the creature she would be leaving soon, and it was sad and started leaving gifts for her. I helped clean out her house and move her things to the facility. She had already been there for a few days and sent me back to her home to grab a couple of things she forgot. Before I left, she grabbed my arm and said, "And if you see my friend out there, tell him I'm okay." It took a moment for me to realize that she was talking about Bigfoot. I nodded and said yes, of course I would tell him. I knew her Bigfoot stories weren't real, but like I said before, it is easier to just agree with their stories and let them believe what they want to. Trying to convince them of reality does more harm than good in most cases. I headed out to the house. It was a 2-hour drive from Ethel's care facility, but I didn't mind. She had become a friend to me over the years, and I was happy to help her. Her house was so quiet when I got there. It hit me then that things would never be the same for Ethel, and in a way, part of her was gone. I tried not to think too much about it and started searching the house for the things she sent me here for. I wasn't there 5 minutes when I heard a knock at the door. No one else was supposed to be at the property. Maybe the realtor was coming early. I didn't know. I headed to the door to see who was there, but when I opened it, nothing. I looked around outside and didn't see any vehicles apart from my own, so I went back inside. I finished packing up a couple of boxes and loaded them into my car. I was unnerved by the strange knock at the door, but thought to myself that maybe I was just hearing things. But then, just as I was about to get into my car and drive away, I saw something in the forest behind the house. It looked like a shadow disappearing between the trees. I didn't get a good look at it, but I just knew. Ethel wasn't some crazy old woman. There was something living in the woods with her, and if I was going to believe her stories, she managed to befriend it. The creature didn't know me and didn't seem willing to show itself. I took a few steps away from my car and yelled into the forest. I was sure the creature didn't understand me, but what else was I going to do? I told it that Ethel says hello and that she's settling in well at her new home, and that she is okay. After I said that, I immediately felt like a crazy person myself, that I was probably talking to a bear or a moose or maybe even just the wind. But then it came out of the trees, just barely, just enough for me to see that I wasn't imagining it. It was just like her paintings, a near 6-foot-tall, two-legged ape. Its face had a human-like expression that is difficult to describe in words. You would need to see it in person. It was the fall of the year when Ethel had to move, and the creature's fur was beginning to turn white underneath. It lingered for a moment before drifting back into the shadows. I told Ethel when I got back to the facility that I had met her friend. She just smiled at me, and that was the end. They live underground. That's why they've been able to remain hidden for so long. At least that's what the wildlife officer told me before he sent me home that night. I asked him why he was telling me all this, and he just laughed and said, because it's true and nobody's going to believe you anyway. Even if you spent your entire life collecting evidence, it will just be another hoax. An urban legend. Believe me, he said, people have tried. And that was that. I went back home. I tried to forget the events of that weekend, but it's been 20 years and I still remember it like it was yesterday. And the officer was right. Everyone I've ever told this story to wrote me off as crazy, but I'll let you be the judge. I was on a guided pack rafting trip in the Yukon. That's the westernmost and smallest territory in Canada for those of your listeners who don't know. The place was so remote that we had to be dropped off by a bush pilot. Our guide was an experienced rafter, but was new to the area. Maybe not the ideal situation, but the travel expenses put us a bit over budget, and this guide was a little cheaper than some of the others we looked at. I learned later from someone local to the area that there are just some places in the Yukon that you don't go. They wouldn't say why, but at that point they didn't have to, and I didn't think to ask. The experienced guides in the area all knew to be wary. Our guide, being new, didn't. And let me tell you, it made for the adventure of our lives. Our trip was a 5-day, 4-night river run. It was through some of the most rugged areas of the Yukon Territory, places you couldn't get to on foot. You could only see this land by water or by air. We all thought of ourselves as adventurous types, but this was something else. Something much more intense. When you get that deep in the wilderness, you feel so small, so insignificant, and completely at the mercy of whatever nature feels like giving you. It wasn't until the second night of 4 that we realized there was something odd going on. By that point, most of us in the party could feel like there was something watching us, following us, but we had no real reason nor any evidence to prove the fact. It was just a strange feeling. I remember going to bed that night in my tent worried that we weren't alone. I was woken up that night at around 2 a.m. to the smell of smoke. I crawled out of my tent, thinking someone in our party must have been cold or perhaps hungry during the night, but that wasn't the case. In fact, I was the last of us to get out of bed. Everyone else was already up, and they were all fixated on the glowing fire from across the river. At first glance, I thought it was a wildfire starting, but I quickly realized that wasn't the case. We could see shadows moving in front of the flames. Human shadows. There were people over there. I asked the guide if he knew of any other rafting parties in the area. I was hopeful that he would be able to explain it all away and we could go back to sleep. We watched the people on the other side of the river for what seemed like ages. They were too far away to get a really good look, but they didn't appear to be another hiking party. I didn't want to be the first one to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. They looked like Neanderthals. I didn't have a logical explanation for it. None of us did. They were gone by morning, or seemed to be gone. We didn't see them at all during the day. But with the wilderness surrounding us, concealing themselves wouldn't be terribly difficult. We rotated sleeping schedules that night so someone would be awake to keep watch. But even with our precautions, we had yet another encounter. We didn't see them that night, but they were there. All night, they circled our camp. We knew because we heard them banging sticks together, banging rocks, making sounds all around to make us know they had us surrounded. And yet, they didn't approach. We built a fire at the center of our camp and kept it burning high throughout the night. I don't think they wanted a confrontation, but they were definitely trying to scare us out of their territory. And it was working. They followed us all the way downriver to our rendezvous site with our pilot. They never engaged with us, but they made certain that we knew they were there and that there were more of them than there were of us. The guy didn't know what to think either. I can't tell you how relieved we all were when we saw the bush plane flying in to get us. We stopped at one of the park's Canada centers on our way out and told them everything that happened. The girl at the counter looked at us like we were crazy, but that's when I had the chance to talk to one of the wildlife officers. In the most casual tone I've ever heard, he told me that there are wild people up there in the north. And he added that they don't like outsiders too much. I said I thought they looked like Neanderthals, like a whole other species. The officer just shrugged his shoulders and said, maybe. He didn't exactly know. He said that it would be pretty hard to study them when you're getting arrows flung your way, and that it would be best to just leave them alone. There aren't many left, and they aren't harming anyone. Despite everyone in our rafting party having the same story, nobody believed us when we got back home. We would tell our story to cold receptions from family and friends who weren't there. So we all just stopped trying. I have to say, the officer was right about one thing. Nobody did believe us, and it was a waste of time trying to convince them. Thank God we have each other. The police know. That's always the most frightening part for me. The people who are supposed to protect us know the truth, and they're keeping it to themselves. The police know, your mayor knows, governor knows. The story's so big and so constant that I doubt there's a single state or national official who hasn't been told the truth in some capacity. I know that they know because I learned the truth, too. I wasn't supposed to find out. I was working for animal control at the time. That career path doesn't exactly scream top secret, does it? Anyway, I managed the calls coming into the animal control center. I relayed information from those calls to our team members working in the field. It was a boring job, but I liked it back then. Even the odd parts I was willing to overlook, even the parts that made my skin crawl. When I first joined the team, they explained to me that all of our calls were filtered by an automated system. The system would say, press 1 if you need to report an animal sighting, and hang up and dial 911 if this is a medical emergency. I didn't question it at first. When we started getting complaints from certain callers that the automated system seemed to be intentionally keeping them in a loop, I took notice. That was when it made me uncomfortable. It made me squirm. Some of those callers described seeing impossible things, sure, but why were they all being filtered out of our system? I told myself that the machine was programmed to keep drunk callers from wasting our time. It wanted to make sure they were getting the right kind of professional help, and animal control couldn't always provide that. That explanation helped me forget. Then came the last call of my career. We got calls about a large dog roaming a residential neighborhood and howling at people through their windows. We sent someone out immediately in case that large dog was dangerous or in case it had been misidentified. We do see the occasional bear around here. At the call center for animal control, there's a secondary line for team members who need to confirm details with people like me. Sometimes they need confirmation of a reported area of interest, and sometimes they need to be reminded what type of animal they were looking for. We do, after all, get the rare instance of intentional misinformation. Sometimes a neighbor doesn't like your pet and wants to see it carried out of the neighborhood in a cage. Anyway, when the team-specific line lit up, I grabbed it immediately. The man on the other end of the phone was out of breath. He sounded scared. He wanted me to confirm a few details. We reviewed the information and decided that he was in the right area, searching for what was likely a burner or a Pyrenees. That didn't calm him down. I realized later that he was looking for an excuse to leave the area. I wish I had given it to him that very moment. He described his investigation thus far over the phone line. He had arrived at the neighborhood and spotted a small forestry patch behind the houses. He figured the dog would be hiding there if anywhere. The patch of woods extended back to a local mountain range. He made sure to move cautiously in case it was a bear lurking in the brush. When he got near, he said he heard the howl. It wasn't a dog's howl, and it wasn't the roar of a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion, which we hadn't seen in years, and it wasn't a wolf or a coyote. He described it as long-winded, high-pitched, and erratic. He said it crept into his ears and made his spine tingle. It made his body shake involuntarily. Just his description through the phone was enough to hitch the breath in my throat. I told him he should get out of there. Whatever it was, we needed more than one man on the case. He could wait for backup and resume the investigation then. He said it was too late, and my heart sank. He walked further into the trees, apparently. As afraid as he was, he wanted to know what kind of animal made that sound. It was so bizarre, he explained, that he thought it might be a group of kids playing a prank on their parents. He didn't think the noise could have belonged to an actual animal. It was a computer recording played over a speaker, he theorized. I asked him why he couldn't turn around if he knew now that it wasn't a prank after all. It was because he saw it. And it saw him. It was an animal, sort of. He said he saw it standing on two legs with its back against a tree. My mind went to bear, of course, but what he said next changed my mind. It was 10 feet tall or thereabouts. When it looked at him, it stepped forward and remained on its hind legs. It didn't wobble like a bear might, trying to keep its balance. It stood upright because that was its nature, covered in brown fur, arms long and thicker than a fire hydrant. He said he reached for his mace and sprayed it into the wind. It carried toward the creature and made it run, but now he didn't know where it was. He didn't know if it was watching him. He was afraid that if he moved or turned his back, it would attack. I made sure backup reached him as soon as possible. He made it out of the woods safely, and the incident was dismissed as a mental breakdown. When that member of our team then took the residents of the neighborhood to a local newspaper, the story was shut down by the mayor. He was made to look insane. I would have considered that to be true, especially since I never saw the beast myself. But then they came for me too. The police arrived at my place of work and forcefully escorted me off of the premises. They said I was wanted in connection to the former employees' acts of disturbing the peace. I was disturbed, I told them. I was disturbed by their willingness to ignore what my teammate was saying. The look in their eyes told me that they knew. They knew that what he encountered that night was real, and they were afraid of it. That meant the police, the mayor, and every other office who worked to shut down the story was aware of the truth. They are aware, and they don't want us to know. It's connected to that automated system, isn't it? Calls of the weird and the bizarre don't make it through, because they don't want us to know how many of these creatures are out there among us. This happened when I was around 10 or 11. I've never told this story to anyone before. Sometimes I like to pretend it was just a bad dream, but I know deep in the pit of my gut that there are terrible things out there, even though I'd like to pretend they don't exist. I was visiting my grandparents for the weekend along with 2 of my cousins. They lived on a big dairy farm in Iowa. This was the 1980s, so we were basically tasked with entertaining ourselves all day, which is how it was for kids back then. No computers, no cell phones. Might sound boring to today's kids, but we always found fun things to do. One of our favorites was hide and seek. Hide and seek can get pretty intense on a large-scale dairy farm. There were all sorts of outdoor buildings as well as a nearby forest. The neighboring farm planted corn and soybeans, and there was a huge hayfield on the other side of the cow pasture, so there were quite literally hundreds of places to hide. Of course, we weren't supposed to go into the cornfield, but that definitely didn't stop us. We had finished helping with chores and ate dinner when we went back outside to play. The rule was that we had to be in by dark. It didn't get dark until nearly 9:30 that time of year, so we figured we had some time. The game of the evening was, of course, hide and seek. My experience happened soon after I had gone into the cornfield to hide. I didn't venture too far in, but it was far enough that I still knew where I was. but was unable to be seen from outside, or so I had hoped. I should mention now that my cousin, who was it for that round, always wore a charm bracelet. The thing was loud and obnoxious and jingled with every step she took, but she would never take it off. However, in hide and seek, that meant we could all hear her coming and find a new hiding place if she was getting close. Of course, we never told her, though. Anyway, I was hunkered down in the cornfield when I heard the unmistakable jingle of the charm bracelet. I started crawling in the opposite direction, hoping to silently evade her and win the game, but I was inadvertently heading deeper and deeper into the cornfield. A little too far from the edge, but I wasn't thinking about that at the time. I was just thinking about winning the game. And if you don't know, it's super easy to lose your direction in the middle of a cornfield. So the charm bracelet was following me, and I was successfully evading it. I don't know how far into the field I was at that point, but I knew it would soon be getting dark. This was supposed to be our last round. I also knew that if I held out until the sun set, I would win. And then, all of a sudden, the sound of the charm bracelet was in front of me rather than behind, where it had been just a second ago. I changed direction and tried to get some distance between it and me. At that point, I didn't know quite where I was in the field or how to get out. The charm bracelet seemed to be chasing me in circles, or at least that is what it felt like. And then all of a sudden I heard my name being called. It was my other cousin, not the one wearing the bracelet, but I knew that she had gone into the old milk house to hide, so I was confused as to why she would be out here. Then the sound of the bracelet picked up again. Was it behind me or in front of me? I couldn't tell. It was like it was coming from multiple directions all at once. I think that was the point at which I knew that something was wrong. I got up and ran. I heard my cousin call my name again, and this time I could tell that she was calling for help. I wished I was brave enough to try to find her, but I wasn't. I ran with intent to get my grandparents. They would be able to help. But I'd gotten so turned around in the cornfield that I came out on the other side of the property and had to run all the way along the edge of the field to get back to the farmhouse. I was outside of the field and running, but I heard the sound of the bracelet again and turned around. I turned around briefly while I ran and saw something running alongside me. It was just inside the cornfield and between the stalks of corn. I barely got a glimpse of it, but it was enough to give me nightmares for years to come. It looked almost human, but I knew it wasn't. I ran faster and faster and finally reached the farmhouse. My cousins were both waiting for me in the yard when I got there. But the freakiest part of the entire story is that both of them denied ever being in the cornfield that night. They said they had found each other right away and were trying to finish the game. Whatever was out there, the thing had tried its damnedest to get me lost in the cornfield. I've heard stories of creatures that can mimic sounds and voices, and while that is terrifying in and of itself, the part that gets me is knowing this creature must have been watching us for quite some time to be able to mimic my cousin's voice and the sound of the charm bracelet, jingling as she ran. Unfortunately for the monster, it had used the wrong cousin's voice, which confused me enough to want to run. If it hadn't slipped up, I'm not sure I would have escaped. I can tell you that I've never played hide and seek outside since that night. Not even now, years later, my own kids in our fenced-in yard. I grew up in a mobile home park. Many of the kids hung out around the neighborhood. So many of us made friends with each other. I had started dating one of my friends that lived down the street. We had known each other for a while, so I knew his family pretty well. His whole family was going on a trip to Florida for a week of vacation, and his mom had asked me if I'd be willing to watch their house. She said that the only thing I really had to do was bring the animals in at night. They had cats and dogs, and I was also supposed to turn the bathroom light and kitchen sink light on so it would give the impression that someone was home. She even said that I was welcome to bring our other friend with me to help, and that we could hang out, watch cable TV, drink sodas, and eat whatever we found in the fridge. Being a teenager in the 90s, I said I'd absolutely love to do it. We didn't have cable at our house, and I thought it would be really cool to have a week or so to watch all the TV that I wanted, as was agreed that I'd bring our other friend with me to help bring in all the animals. Their cats had recently had a new litter of kittens, and they all liked to hang out under the skirting of the house. So we'd basically have to crawl under the house to get them. It wasn't fun, but it was a job. One night in particular, we went to the house. It was already getting pretty dark, but we didn't have anywhere to be, so we took our time relaxing. We were hanging out, watching TV, drinking some colas, and I noticed that in one of the bedrooms down the hall, there seemed to be something peeking out from behind the door. I kept seeing the flickering of a shadow. I didn't think anything of it at first, so I just kept watching TV with my friend. Several minutes go by, but then I started hearing this weird noise coming from that same room. I told my friend that I was going to go and check if one of the animals was in there messing with things. I got up, walked past my friend and down the hall. I turned on the light. I noticed immediately that it wasn't a pet making the noise, but rather a toy. My boyfriend had a younger sibling, a sister, and the room that this was happening in was hers. The toy was a wind-up toy. I was familiar with it because I'd seen his sister playing with it before. It had some little penguin figurines that would climb up this small mountain and slide back down. As I'm looking at this toy, and I'm watching the penguins climb up and slide down, I'm wondering what could have made it go off. I know that weird electrical surges like lighting can set of a toy, but it wasn't even raining outside. The toy was unusual in that it had to be wound up before it would be activated. So it was a little weird that the toy would wind up on its own and start making a ruckus out of nowhere. I didn't really know what to do or what to think, so I went back into the living room and started watching TV again. But it wasn't long after that I felt that I noticed something peeking out from behind the door again. This time I got a better glimpse. It looked like a shadowy figure. It was standing straight up, and I could see part of a leg going up to a hand and arm, part of a neck, and part of the head showing itself for a brief second before it would hide itself again. I was really considering if I was going crazy. I asked my friend if she saw it. She said that she hadn't. It was starting to weird me out at this point, but what could I do? So I tried to shake off the fear that I had, but then it happened again. This time my friend shouted, "I saw it. What was that thing?" I told her I didn't know, but that I had seen it multiple times at this point. Something from inside that room was messing with us. I said that I was not feeling comfortable at all about this. Neither was my friend. So I said, "Let's get the cats inside the house so we can get out of here." My friend agreed. She didn't want to be there anymore either. I really didn't want to go down that hallway again. But of course, the bathroom was down that hallway, and I had to turn the light on before we left. That was one of the main requests that the family had. So I decided I'd do it first, before we started to get the cats in from outside. So now the light in the bathroom is on, and we go outside and start bringing all the cats in, and the dog, too, who was on his chain. But when we came in with the final group of cats, the bathroom light was now off. My friend said, "Hey, I thought you turned on the bathroom light." I said I did. We are really freaked out now. So I run down the hall, turn the light back on, we close and lock the door, and we run out towards the street. By the time that we left, I was shaking, and so was my friend. We had a hill that we would wall up to cut through the park and get to my house quicker. So as we were walking up the hill, I decided to look back at the house and make sure the bathroom light was still on. You know, just in case. Both my friend and I could see the bathroom light was still on, but we also noticed something else. It looked like the silhouette of a man slowly standing up and peeking out the window, looking back and forth, left to right. It was like he was looking for us. We turned and looked up the hill towards the park and ran as fast as we could until we got to my house. To this day, my friend refuses to talk about the incident at all. I think she's trying to bury it. I'm not sure what exactly was going on with that house, but it was definitely something that I don't ever want to experience again. And from that day forward until they got home, I always brought my mom with me to close up their house. Cable could wait. It wasn't worth hanging out in that house ever again. Hi, I'm writing in with a story about what I think was a dogman that harassed my family for a while in our hometown. I'm from Galloway, Ohio, although it's technically not a town. It's just southwest of Columbus, Ohio. My dad is a pediatric surgeon in Columbus, and I'm going to college at Ohio State. I'm a junior now and decided after my freshman year to live on campus, even though my family's home is close enough that I could commute. I like the freedom, and it's easier for me to make friends and keep up with classes if I'm on campus. My mom wasn't thrilled with this at first, but my sister still lives at home, and I was going home almost every weekend for dinner and to do laundry for free, like every college student does. When I moved in my sophomore year, my mom decided to get chickens as a hobby. She's been a stay-at-home mom since my sister was born, and once we were old enough, started volunteering for church, but I think she was feeling a little restless around that time. She started off with 3 chickens and a small coop, but eventually convinced my dad to get a flock of 12 and expand the coop. My mom loves the chickens and definitely pampers them. Sometimes I'll even stop home on weekend mornings for egg sandwiches. I was just starting my second semester of my sophomore year when my sister Jenny called me and told me that my mom was really upset because 2 of her chickens had been killed. Jenny said she thought at first it was a neighborhood dog or a fox, but the weird thing was that the whole chicken was gone. My parents' neighbors also had chickens, and the same thing had happened the same night. They'd dealt with foxes before, but said foxes usually left most of the chicken behind. In my mom's coop, there was just a bunch of feathers, and the chicken was missing. It definitely looked like there had been a struggle, and Jenny said the feathers were almost in a straight line out the door, and I could tell over the phone she was weirded out by it. I shrugged it off as nothing serious and suggested they get a motion light out there and just make sure everything was secure. Jenny was quiet and then told me that they'd already checked around and everything seemed perfectly secure. There were no holes, no ways in, and the door to the enclosure was shut and locked still. That was weird, but at my age, I didn't care so much, so just changed the conversation. A little over a week later, I went home for dinner and could tell my mom was upset. She told me that she'd lost another chicken the night before, and they were now down to 7+1 rooster that I hated because it always came after me. I tried to joke around that it was too bad whatever it was hadn't taken the rooster, but my dad gave me a look that told me to be quiet, so I did. I found out later that their neighbors had experienced the exact same thing on the same night, again. At this point, my dad and the neighbor were highly doubting it was a fox. 4 chickens total between the 2 houses had been taken, and that was way too much for a fox to manage. My dad's colleague suggested a trail camera, so he bought one online and set it up when it arrived a few days later. Jenny was keeping me up to date with all of the happenings via text, and since my classes that semester were easy, I found myself intrigued by what was going on and waiting for updates. I'd actually seen the trail of feathers the weekend I went over for dinner and agreed privately that it was weird. It looked almost like someone had plucked the chicken while walking away, leaving handfuls of feathers at even intervals. There also hadn't been blood anywhere. By now, it was about midway through April, and for almost 2 weeks, nothing happened. I kept going home for dinner and expecting updates, but it all seemed calm and quiet. And then one morning, my dad called me. That was strange because we usually only texted and he was always busy with work, so it was more of a check-in than a conversation. But I could tell as soon as I answered that something had him upset or excited. He was talking quickly, and it was all about the chickens. I made him slow down and repeat some of the stuff I hadn't caught. He told me that the night before, something had taken 2 more chickens. When my mom went to feed the chickens that morning and realized she got my dad, who was about to leave for work. He took the trail camera to work with him and had time before his first surgery to check out the photos on his computer. What they showed was the reason he was freaking out. He was texting me the photos as we talked, and I put him on speaker to look at them, thinking he must be wrong. But the photos showed some kind of dog, creature walking on 2 legs. It definitely had a muzzle and sparse hair all over its upper body, with the hair getting thicker around its legs. The feet were huge and almost human-like. It was hard to tell from the camera, and because they were shot at night, but the thing must have been at least 5.5 to 6 feet tall. There were only a few photos that showed it. The dog creature walked into the frame on 2 legs and its eyes were shining reflexively. In the next frame, the enclosure door was open and the thing was crouching kind of out of the frame. In the last photo, it was walking away with 2 chickens in one hand. It had a sort of cropped tail, but the back looked very human and very muscular. Dad said my mom was really upset and he wasn't sure he should show the neighbors the photos. We talked for so long that I ended up missing my first class. We both agreed that the thing must have been able to actually unlatch the enclosure door since it had human hands and went inside and just picked up whatever chickens it wanted. And it was plucking them when it left, which was why the trail of feathers was so perfect and bloodless. Eventually, my dad had to go back to work and I had to get to classes. I was thinking about it all day, but didn't talk about it with anyone. When I went home for dinner 2 days later, my dad pulled me aside to tell me he'd deleted the photos and told my mom it was just a fox. He wasn't going to say anything to the neighbors either, and he ended up putting a combination lock on the enclosure door. My mom thought that was weird, but I think she knew something was up and was too afraid to ask. Soon after that, the chickens stopped being taken, but our neighbors would still lose 1 or 2 every few weeks. To this day, I've never said anything to my mom or sister or anyone else. It's weird knowing that there's a dogman creature out there walking around in Ohio, but there's no point in being scared, I guess, since it's never gone after humans as far as I know. Just chickens. My ex-partner Owen and I had been looking forward to a romantic getaway, and we thought that his summer cottage would be the perfect location. It held a special significance to him, as it was where his mother grew up. He had fond memories of spending his summers there as a child. The cottage was located on a tiny island off the coast of Massachusetts. It was surrounded by nature and seclusion, making it the ideal place for a peaceful retreat. But getting to the island required a bit of effort. There was a road where we had to leave cars since the island was only accessible by foot. The road was in a remote area, and then from there, we had to walk about 1.5 miles through the dense woods, and then take a boat across a small waterway. When we got to the cottage, I right away started feeling uneasy. Also, the key to the front door was nowhere to be found, which was strange and added to the discomfort I was already feeling. I tried to shake it off and convince myself that I was just tired from the trip. Owen was tall and slender and figured out how to get in. He was able to slip through a small window and open the door from the inside. I was glad he was so flexible because I sure wouldn't have been able to get in there. We unpacked our stuff and started a fire to heat up the sauna, which was a tradition during midsummer in his family. I went in the bedroom to get it ready for us. As soon as I walked into the room, I was overcome by a strong feeling of fear, as if we weren't supposed to be there. I tried to ignore what I was feeling. I didn't want to spoil our weekend, so I didn't mention anything to Owen about it. Before getting into the sauna, we decided to have a quick snack. While we were eating, I noticed that Owen was starting to look pale and unwell. He told me that he had suddenly started feeling sick and was feeling really chilled. I felt his forehead and he had a high fever. It seemed bizarre that he had gotten ill so suddenly. He had been feeling perfectly fine just a few minutes before. We decided to just go to the bedroom and rest. Although I wasn't particularly thrilled about going back into that room, it was the only place for him to lay down. I remember what happened next really clearly. Owen fell asleep on the bed, breathing heavily and radiating a sickly heat. Meanwhile, I was wide awake and highly alert. The feeling of dread from before came back, but this time it grew into an overwhelming fear. My heart was racing because I was realizing what a remote location we were in. There was no phone service and I felt like I had nothing to treat him with. And then I saw something approach the bedroom. In the doorway, there was a shadowy figure who definitely seemed male. The figure leaned toward us and was exuding intense hatred. Although it didn't fully enter the room, it made it clear that if it chose to do so, it could. I gathered my courage and woke Owen up, telling him that we needed to leave right away. I mentioned the apparition I had seen, but mainly stressed that we needed to get to a populated area before he got any worse. He felt really weak, but I was able to help him stand and gather our stuff. The malicious figure had disappeared all of a sudden when I focused on helping Owen. We packed really fast and got the hell out of there. But when we made it to the other side of the river, he suddenly improved and his fever disappeared. He actually suggested going back to the cottage, but there was no way I was going to agree to that. We returned to his parents' home, where they were having their gathering for the midsummer celebration. When they asked why we were back already, I just said that Owen hadn't been feeling well. I didn't want to mention anything about the strange events that had happened. I started to question my own experience after everything started to feel so normal at the family gathering. We started to relax and were having a drink and conversing with Owen's relatives. Everything seemed fine, and I wondered if I had only imagined seeing something strange. Then Owen's uncle suddenly brought up the topic of the cottage being haunted. The mention of this made me feel a wave of fear all over again. The uncle said that his father had heard about strange occurrences happening at the place even before he was born, passed down from his own father. Then he told the story of a mysterious old man who had showed up at the door and claimed that he was there to fix things. He had traced lines around the yard using metal wire while muttering strange sounds to himself. Once he finished, he said that he had redirected the energy flows around the property so that the house would no longer be disturbed by any evil presence. Then he just left. But the thing is, my brother, who was a landscaper, had done work at the cottage the year before. I remember him telling me that he had removed a bunch of weird old wire that he had found buried on the property. I couldn't help but wonder if the ghost had returned following the removal of the wire. I felt queasy inside. I didn't ask much about the supposed ghost and its past activities, but I couldn't help but wonder what could have happened to us if we hadn't gotten out of there. I never returned to the cottage and never experienced anything like that again.